A few years ago, I said what has to be my least controversial statement of all time: Churchill was an idiot. Shockingly, many people actually agree with me. And I say shockingly because many see Churchill as one of the best politicians in British history, which isn't saying much when you look at the competition. Well, one of my patrons has asked, would you elaborate on that? He definitely made some mistakes, plus I'm not even remotely a fan of him due to, and amongst the others, his contribution to the Bengal famine, etc. But I would be curious to hear your reasoning, as you tend to approach World War II from new perspectives and shed light on less known areas of it. Yes, and I want to make this clear. When I said Churchill was an idiot, I wasn't even referring to his contribution to the Bengal famine. I wasn't even talking about Gallipoli in the First World War, or his political shenanigans, or his disastrous failure in Norway, nor was I referring to the setting up of Operation Keelhaul, or the fact he was pro-fascist in the interwar period. I was referring purely to his actions in the early to mid Second World War period in North Africa and the Middle East, as well as in Greece. Yet, despite this limitation, there's loads of examples I could give here of how Churchill was an idiot and made the situation worse for the Allies. The National Socialists of today like to say it was Churchill who started the war, but in reality, because of all the screw-ups, Churchill was one of their greatest allies. And I want to make it clear, what makes Churchill an idiot in my mind is his schoolboy attitude to war. He has this want or drive to just get into a fight. He wants to start a war, attack, and just get to grips with the enemy. And this immature and ignorant attitude was there right from the start, from the Boer War to Gallipoli and into the Second World War, starting with Norway. In 1939, Churchill was the First Lord of the Admiralty, same as he had been in the First World War, and at this point was pro-war. During the lull in the winter of 1939, after the invasion of Poland, the British were reluctant to expand the war further. It was bad enough that Poland, Britain and France were at war with Germany as it was, let alone if more countries got involved, hence why this period has since been called the Phony War, because both sides were reluctant to engage each other. Churchill, though, proposed the mining of the Norwegian port of Narvik because it would stop Swedish iron ore shipments from reaching Germany, and more importantly for him, would open up the war. It would force the Germans to retaliate, which is what Churchill wanted because he wanted to get to grips with his enemy. Now, why would you want to do this? Bearing in mind that the First World War had been a disaster for Britain, as well as the rest of Europe, so why would you want to escalate the conflict and potentially have a second disaster? This is especially so because the British didn't have enough troops to protect Norway, so any attack on Norway would result in a British failure. Also, the Scandinavian countries had remained neutral in the First World War and wanted to do so again in the Second. Therefore, why would you risk it? Well, it's because Churchill wanted a good old scrap, and the sources make this clear. Just listen to the arrogance of his own explanation. We should not allow neutrals to tie our hands while we were fighting to defend their liberty. They wouldn't have been involved in the war in the first place had you not been fighting on their soil. It's nothing to do with their liberty. Their liberty is to stay neutral. Churchill was wanting to violate that neutrality, violate their liberty for selfish reasons, and then says it's their fault that they're not letting the British fight for their liberty. It's a completely self-centered way of looking at the world. And he's not the only one spouting this view, of course, but this attitude was not only against the majority of the British public at the time, but would also lead to disaster in Norway and more disasters later in the war. Neville Chamberlain was still Prime Minister at this point and was worried of what the neutral countries would think if Britain violated Norwegian neutrality. He had one eye on the United States, who might think Britain was just as bad as Germany if she got involved in Norway. So, knowing this, Churchill got in touch with Roosevelt and found out that because Roosevelt was facing another election in the near future, Roosevelt didn't want any Americans to die for Norway. Thus, Churchill declared that the Americans wouldn't be interested at all if the British moved into Norway. But that's not necessarily the correct interpretation of the situation. Just because the Americans wouldn't want to die for Norway doesn't mean that they'll be happy for the British to violate Norwegian neutrality. But again, Churchill just wants to escalate the war and bring war to the Norwegians for what was essentially some iron ore which the British didn't have the means to hold on to anyway. In the end, the Soviet invasion of Finland, the Winter War, convinced the British High Command that a plan for Norway had to be considered. So, Churchill was tasked with coming up with a plan to intervene in northern Norway for the sake of Finland, and also to consider the consequences of a German occupation of southern Norway. Without going too in-depth here, the Scandinavians had no chance of defending themselves from either Britain or Germany at this point. Denmark only had 14,000 men in arms, Norway just 56,000. But to the east, the Finns somehow stopped the Soviets for a couple of months, and then when the major Soviet attack on the Mannerheim Line began in February 1940, the Finns asked the West for help. It was realised that the mere threat of intervention on the part of the Western Allies would probably cause the Soviets to back off a little and negotiate peace, so the British troops began embarking, ready for an intervention in Norway to stop the Soviets and the Germans, who definitely weren't allied or anything. But when the Soviets and Finns signed peace, Chamberlain called off the operation, and Churchill was upset, arguing that they should still invade Norway, but Chamberlain said no. All has now fallen to the ground because so cumbrous are our processes that we were too late. Again, it's that schoolboy attitude of just acting and not thinking of the consequences of your actions that makes itself very apparent here. Anyway, the Germans then did invade Scandinavia, and Churchill said this in the House of Commons. It is not the slightest use blaming the Allies for not being able to give substantial help and protection to neutral countries if we are kept at arm's length until these neutrals are actually attacked. True, but you're still not allowed to invade a neutral country to stop another power from possibly invading that neutral country. If you do violate neutrality, you're no different from Hitler, and the fact that the British were considering invading Norway before the Germans is perhaps one of the reasons why Hitler went ahead and invaded Norway, to preempt the British. At the end of the day, if neutral countries want to remain neutral and then get invaded, that's their fault, not yours. But at the same time, just because you want to stop an enemy power doesn't mean you can invade neutral countries. That's a violation of neutrality and is no different than Hitler invading Poland. Plus, Churchill would send troops all over the place, such as Norway, Greece and Crete, and get them destroyed anyway. So just because the British can send help doesn't mean that they should. You have to pick your battles and not just send off your troops in all directions, getting them wiped out piecemeal, which is exactly what happened later under Churchill's watch. So this attitude of just sending troops everywhere to get into a scrap is a schoolboy mentality. Then, when the Germans do invade Norway, Churchill puts into action the plan he came up with for Norway, saying, "Our hands were now free and we could apply our overwhelming sea power on the Norwegian coast. We could liquidate their landings in a week or two." The arrogance of this statement is unreal, especially considering what actually happened in Norway. Churchill is both underestimating the enemy and overestimating British strength, something he would do time and time again. And to the Norwegians he said, "We are coming as soon as possible and in great strength." Yes, except for the strength bit. We have evidence that in the evening after he sent this message, he worked late into the night, fueled by copious amounts of alcohol, because every successful military campaign is planned by an alcoholic. Worse, it was at this very moment when he changed the plan. Churchill had originally wanted to just take Narvik, but at the last minute, and fueled by alcohol and a lack of sleep, he decided to change the plan and take Narvik as well as all of central Norway. He wasn't the only one who decided this, others agreed with him, but this last-minute decision to change the plan created confusion amongst the officers and men and ultimately resulted in disaster. I'm not going to go into detail here because we'll be here all day, but a nice and fairly neutral book on the Norwegian campaign is The Norway Campaign and the Rise of Churchill 1940 by an author with an unfortunate name that YouTube will chastise me for if I say it out loud. Nonetheless, it's a good book where practically all of the references for this section of the video are coming from, so check it out if you're interested. Needless to say though, Churchill's schoolboy attitude caused a mess even before the fighting had started. He then intervened on several occasions, even bypassing an admiral at one point, and again this didn't help the situation, as this author concludes. Churchill argued that German naval losses amounted to a victory, but then again he even managed to turn Dunkirk into some sort of triumph. Worse, it was the failure of the British campaign in central Norway a good 5 weeks before the collapse of France that brought Churchill to power. In May 1940, Parliament effectively surrendered its powers to a coalition government led by one stubborn old man who virtually established a dictatorship for the duration of the war. But I'm not allowed to talk about politics or economics, so let's stick to tanks and dive into the British Somalia campaign. I've done a whole video on this earlier on in the channel's history. It was my third Battlestorm documentary ever, but in a nutshell, Godwin Austen, who was only appointed commander of Somalia several days after the campaign had already begun, was outnumbered, outgunned, and in a strategically poor situation. Despite all this, and despite being placed in an impossible position, Churchill wanted Godwin Austen to fight on and not evacuate. He also wanted Godwin Austen to inflict maximum damage on the Italians if he was ultimately forced to evacuate. Well, the British did inflict damage before they escaped, 260 British losses versus 2,052 Italian losses, but this wasn't enough to satisfy Churchill's bloodlust, and thus Churchill was incredibly angry at Godwin Austen, and Wavell had to step in to defend him. When Churchill heard of the success of the evacuation and comparatively light British casualties, he became extremely agitated, believing the lower British casualty figures indicated that the withdrawal from this then strategically useless territory had been conducted without first putting up a good fight. Again, this is that no-thinking schoolboy attitude of just getting to grips with the enemy no matter the cost. The Prime Minister fired a red-hot cable to Wavell, ordering him to suspend Godwin Austen and conduct a court of inquiry. Wavell was understandably upset at this charge of pusillanimity, which means cowardice, and immediately cabled to Churchill refusing to hold a court of inquiry and ending the message with "a big butcher's bill was not necessarily evidence of good tactics." Dill later told Wavell that this telegram, and especially the last sentence, roused Churchill to greater anger than he had ever seen him in before. Churchill hadn't got his way, so he spat his dummy out. Churchill never forgot about this event and would later remove Wavell and also Godwin Austen from their positions. There was no valid case for relieving Wavell. In his 2 years in the Middle East, he had built a base and a command structure from nothing. He had conquered the whole of Italian East Africa, had captured 200,000 prisoners, including the Duke of Aosta, Viceroy of Ethiopia. Under his strategic aegis, O'Connor had taken Cyrenaica and another 200,000 prisoners. Between February and June 1941, he had conducted 6 major campaigns, never less than 3 at a time, and in May, 5 at a time. No other British soldier of the day had the strategic grasp, the sagacity, the cool nerves, and the immense powers of leadership to do all these things and steer a course free of total disaster. Certainly, Wavell's career had been latterly clouded by defeat. Greece, Cyrenaica, Crete. Yet Greece and Cyrenaica, the most serious of the 3, were the Prime Minister's responsibility. Dismissal of Wavell, in fact, if not in intention, made him a scapegoat for Churchill's own mistakes. And then there's Godwin Austen. After Cabinet, Grigg and I tackled the Prime Minister again about Cunningham and Godwin Austen, but without any luck. I cannot make out his attitude about it. The moment their names are mentioned, one might imagine they were criminals of the worst order. This next quote by Allenbrook really indicates that schoolboy attack mentality.
According to him, these officers had failed in action, had proved themselves deficient of offensive spirit, should never be employed again, and could indeed consider themselves lucky that they were not being made a public example of, as in the case of Admiral Byng.
Historians like Daniel Butler and Playfair make the case that Wavell and Auchinleck were given command of too few forces spread out over too large an area. They had the entire Middle East to deal with, which meant that they were fighting on at least 2 or more campaigns at the same time, and it wasn't until the summer of 1942 that Churchill realised that he had overworked the Middle East Command, at which point he then split it into 2. So, for the first 2 years of the campaign, Churchill overtaxed his generals, leading them to make mistakes. Now, this isn't a Madman Churchill video. I'm not making the case that Churchill is entirely to blame for everything that happened. The commanders certainly made their own mistakes, and the circumstances just weren't in their favour at times. However, on numerous occasions, Churchill stretched his commanders to breaking point, diverted or even took resources away from them just when they needed them most, and then demanded that they attack. As I explained in my Rommel's First Battle in the North African Campaign video all the way back in 2016, just as Wavell and O'Connor were on the brink of total victory in North Africa in the aftermath of Operation Compass, Churchill pulled forces away from them and sent them to get beaten in Greece. O'Connor had to abandon his plan to take Tripoli, which, if he had, would have meant that Rommel wouldn't have been able to land in North Africa at all. The Desert Fox would never have been. Now, there's a debate about whether O'Connor would have gotten there in time or not, or even could have gone the distance at all. In fact, that's another Patreon question we'll be coming back to in the future, so be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. But Churchill robbing units from North Africa at this point no doubt made the situation worse, and led to Rommel's first victory in the desert. And before Operation Battle Axe, it was Churchill once again who was putting pressure on Wavell to attack immediately.
You have at the present moment 530,000 soldiers on your rationed strength, some 500 field guns, 350 AA guns, 450 heavy tanks and 350 anti-tank guns. In the months of January to May, upwards of 7,000 mechanical vehicles have reached you, yet you are evidently hard put to find a brigade, or even a battalion, and in continual telegrams you complain of your shortage of transport, which you declare limits all your operations.
No understanding of the logistics. No understanding that you can't just dump half-trained men and equipment in a new land and expect them to be operational. No understanding that the tanks, trucks and planes had to be converted to operate in desert conditions. No ability to fathom that not all these troops were in the North African desert, that many of them were spread out over the entire Middle East. And it's a lie anyway. The British didn't have heavy tanks at all at this time. It's just needless pressure.
Wavell had vast responsibilities, his command spanning 9 countries, 2 continents, and measuring 2,000 by 1,700 miles. He had scant resources to defend this vast tract. In addition, he had diplomatic duties to deal with. The French in Syria and North Africa, consultations with HM ambassadors in Egypt, Iraq, the Governor-General in the Sudan, the High Commissioner for Palestine and Transjordan, the governors of Cyprus, Aden, and British Somaliland, and the political agents in the Persian Gulf. Wavell was given a headquarters staff of 5 officers.
So Churchill pressured Wavell to attack, Wavell then attacks, loses, and then Churchill gets upset at Wavell. Then, because Wavell had already lost Greece and Crete, both of which were Churchill's fault because he had decided to get involved there again without sufficient troops, Wavell was therefore sacked.
In this case, Churchill's haste was a factor in the defeat and it cost Wavell his job, although not his reputation.
Churchill's reputation was such that, even before Auchinleck had taken office, Auchinleck was warned by General Dill, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, that Auchinleck was about to receive a ton of pressure from Churchill to start his battles prematurely. In fact, Churchill was already asking Auchinleck to give him a date when he was going to attack before Auchinleck had even taken charge.
It was Auchinleck's first acquaintance with that special anxiety which dwarfed all the other mammoth anxieties of the Middle East Command. Auchinleck was not as diplomatic a man as Wavell. His instinct was to oppose the Prime Minister's interference bluntly and resolutely. The battle between them was soon underway.
Auchinleck told Churchill by telegram that he was prepared to take risks, but only those that were reasonably justified. Attacking prematurely wasn't on the cards. Churchill called Auchinleck to London for consultation, but even then Auchinleck didn't give in. Nonetheless, the pressure was there, and we can see that silly schoolboy attitude of attack, attack, attack getting in the way of military reality. Barry Pitt, in his excellent series The Crucible of War, highly recommended, explains that Auchinleck was under a barrage of messages from Churchill. All of them were abrupt, pressuring and urgent in their demands for an immediate attack. Auchinleck resisted, saying that he needed more tanks and troops, which just infuriated Churchill.
Auchinleck's stock at Downing Street after 3 weeks stood little higher than Wavell's had after 12 months. Auchinleck continued to resist though, and the Prime Minister was beginning to regret that Auchinleck had ever been appointed Commander-in-Chief Middle East. It is impossible to explain to Parliament and the nation how it is our Middle East armies have had to stand for 4.5 months without engaging the enemy.
How about it's because you didn't send enough troops and equipment to actually get the job done? How about it's because it takes time to organise and prepare for a battle? How about it's because we don't just rush into defeat, which is pretty much what happened anyway thanks to you? Now, Operation Crusader was technically a victory for the British because the front line moved forwards, but if you made it through my 9-hour documentary on it, you'll know it was a close run thing. It was more that Rommel lost the battle than the British won it. The British really tried to lose that battle, so Churchill's attack, attack, attack mentality wasn't helping them win. Then Japan entered the war, so in the aftermath of victory at Crusader, Churchill did exactly what he'd done in the aftermath of Operation Compass. He pulled forces from North Africa to send them to the Far East. Then, when Rommel received reinforcements, attacked and defeated the remnants of the British 8th Army and looked like he was about to take Benghazi, Churchill heard about the British preparations to destroy and abandon the port on the 24th of January 1942. He therefore sent an angry telegram to Auchinleck ordering him to stop Godwin Austen from doing this, which went against General Ritchie's orders to blow the port. The desert generals ended up complying and started talking about counter-attacking Rommel, even though the situation was clearly out of hand and an attack was just simply impossible. Gee, I wonder why they were thinking of attacking at this point.
Behind both Auchinleck and Ritchie was the hot breath of Churchill, whose ill-judged pressure for Operation Acrobat, an attack towards Tunisia, was the real problem.
As I concluded in my Rommel's second offensive video, Ritchie and Auchinleck definitely have some of the blame for letting optimism blind them. But they had to be optimistic because it was Churchill who was pressuring them into the idea of an offensive that simply had no chance of happening. Ultimately, Churchill's schoolboy attitude to war caused these defeats, and he didn't learn his lesson. As early as the 7th of February 1942, London was pushing for answers regarding when Auchinleck was going to attack next. This was literally days after the retreat had ended. Auchinleck once again resisted placing a firm date on an attack, but Churchill kept writing to Auchinleck, and the pressure and the arguments continued all the way up until late May, when Rommel attacked first, starting the Battle of Gazala. By this point, Churchill had again removed entire divisions from North Africa and sent them to the Turkish border or east to fight Japan. But it didn't matter, his attitude was attack, attack, attack. Churchill wrote to Auchinleck saying that Auchinleck had superiority in tanks, infantry and air power and so should attack. But that simply wasn't true. They did have more tanks in terms of numbers, but the British tanks were terrible compared to the Germans. And even though they would eventually get M3 medium tanks before Gazala, they arrived last minute and weren't fully prepared or organised into their respective units when Rommel attacked. And tanks can't run without fuel, which the British were short of because 2 petrol tankers had been sunk by the Axis as they sailed on their way to Tobruk. But because Malta was under siege, Churchill put pressure on Auchinleck to attack in order to distract the Axis from the island. Auchinleck responded that the army wasn't prepared for battle and that attacking too early might result in disaster and even the loss of Egypt. He asked, would London be so desperate to save Malta that they lose the Middle East? Well, Churchill got angry, demanding that Auchinleck come to London for another consultation. This time though, Auchinleck point-blank refused. He said he couldn't leave the Middle East because he had too much work to do and nobody else could fill his role. Churchill saw this refusal as a ploy by Auchinleck to escape responsibility, so therefore considered removing Auchinleck. In the end, he sent Sir Stafford Cripps and Lieutenant General Nye to Auchinleck to put pressure on Auchinleck to attack. However, after speaking with Auchinleck, Cripps and Nye sided with Auchinleck against Churchill, and then produced a detailed report that ruled out the possibility of an attack. His plan had backfired, and Churchill was not amused to say the least. And there's more to this story than this, but in the end, Auchinleck had to bow to Churchill's pressure or face the sack. Auchinleck agreed to attack to help Malta even though his forces were not ready, and Churchill got his way, or at least he would have done had Rommel not attacked first. But you can see again, the schoolboy attitude that Churchill has had right from the beginning damages his generals' ability to conduct their campaigns and leads to some of the disasters that happened during the war. And I haven't really mentioned Greece, I haven't really mentioned Gallipoli, or Singapore, or the Bengal famine, or numerous other battles and campaigns that Churchill helped mess up. I haven't mentioned Keel Hall, or even the naval or air war, and in the future I will talk about these subjects. Yet it's hard for me not to conclude that Churchill was simply the cause of a lot of the problems the British faced. Not all, but a lot of them. He made the situation worse. In terms of military strategy, at the very least, he was a bit of an idiot. That's why I concluded this in the past.
Churchill supposedly said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." But in reality, he actually said, "For my part, I consider that it will be found much better by all parties to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history."
But regardless, the idea is the same. Like a typical politician, Churchill wanted to twist the facts to make himself look good, and that's exactly what he did. Norway was a disaster. Dunkirk was a disaster, yet somehow a lot of people have viewed Churchill as a great politician. The BBC conducted a poll in 2002, and Churchill was voted the greatest Briton ever, mainly because of his contribution to the Second World War. If only these people had known that Churchill's contributions to the Second World War actually hindered Britain in a lot of ways, maybe they wouldn't have been voting that way. But how would you vote? Am I right? Was Churchill an idiot, or was he the greatest Briton ever? Did he help or hinder the British war effort? Let me know in the comments below, and if you'd like to hear about a crime that Churchill committed at the end of the war, which the British, Americans and Russian governments don't want you to know about, check out my series on Operation Keel Hall. Thanks for watching, bye for now.